No matter where you're at on your GMing journey, there's one topic that comes up over and over again. Prep. What should you be prepping? What shouldn't you be prepping? How much is too much? How much is too little? As a GM that's been doing this for a while, a common question I get asked is how I go about prepping my games. And like most things I do, it has less to do with setting up interesting encounter designs or story threads, and more to do with the actual human dynamics at the table. Hi, I'm John, and this is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming. And today, we're talking about my method for prepping my D&D sessions. Let's get into it. First off, I just want to mention, if I sound a little nasally today, I'm coming off some kind of cold and a lot of congestion. Hopefully I'll be back to normal by the time I'm ready to record the next video. Before tumbling too far down this particular rabbit hole, I do want to clear up a few things. First, I am by no means claiming this is a definitive, foolproof guide to prep. This was a requested topic about how I go about prepping my games, and those insights might even stem from fundamental disagreements you have about my game mastering philosophy, methodology, or preferences. In other words, just because I do something doesn't mean it's going to work for you. But it may get you to start asking insightful questions that can help you refine your own process. Second, if you haven't started GMing yet, you really don't know how much you need to prep or what kind of content you need to prep in order to run your best game. In my experience, I've had a lot of conversations with game masters that have all sorts of theories of how their game will run. But when those theories meet actual players in an actual game session, a lot of the time they don't hold up. A tangential example that I've come across multiple times is a GM offering a powerful magic item to a player, but at some sort of cost, like entering a pact with a fiend or something like that. And a lot of times, the player will surprise the GM, not in a good way, by determining that that cost was too high for the reward they were going to get. Having watched my fair share of players cross the threshold into becoming GMs themselves, a lot of times GMs hesitate on trying out GMing because they don't feel prepared. And let me say, you're never really 100% prepared. The only way you can refine your sense of prep is by getting down into the weeds and starting to GM. If you are a new GM, I actually recommend checking out my other video, the 7 Baby Steps to Masterful GMing, to get you started on your GMing journey. Third, when I talk about my specific process, it's designed to support my specific style and preferences when it comes to running games. Over the years, I've really refined what I love to run as a GM and cultivated a particular culture at my table of players that enjoy the games that I run. The kinds of things we're interested in are heavy character development, social interaction with high emotional stakes, and combat that encourages critical thinking and creativity. What we're not really interested in are lengthy dungeon crawls, deadly encounter design, or granular resource management. Now, if you really like those things and your group is having a blast playing with them, more power to you. Just know when I talk about my specific process, there may be some bullet points that are more or less relevant to you because of that. All right, with all those disclaimers out of the way, let's dive into it. The first question I ask whenever I start prepping a game is, how much time do I have? There's actually two sides of this coin to consider, but first I want to start with session length. How much real-world time is everybody expecting and actually able to play? Now, I've been in some groups that love a 12-hour marathon session that takes a complete day. I've also played in some groups, one which is a game I run, where the players kind of peter out after about 90 minutes. These two preferences require completely different methods of prep. There's a different amount of content that they're expected to be able to go through. And even more so than how much time we schedule, what's the threshold where the game stops being enjoyable because everyone starts getting tired? My personal sweet spot as a GM is about 5 to 6 hours. After about 6 hours, I start losing track of stuff, I start getting a little grumpier. So when I'm asked to GM, and assuming there are no scheduling constraints from any of the other players, 6 hours tends to be our max. So I want to make sure that I prep some meaningful moments within that time frame. Another thing I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again, is how frequently you're playing. If you're playing a weekly session, you can expect your players to remember a certain amount of details more than usually what I have time for, which is a monthly session. Because my sessions are only about once a month, sometimes longer than that, one thing I try to prep for is having a complete episode told within a single session. Even if there's an ongoing story or some overarching plot that the players are investigating, each session has an episodic beginning, middle, and end within that overarching story loop. Very similar to how a lot of television shows are written nowadays. One little thing I'd like to add here, I find that a lot of new GMs, when they're given a certain time frame, think they have to fill that time or even go a little bit over it. My experience has shown me the opposite. Players actually appreciate if you can fit your entire prepped game within the time frame that everyone has agreed to. If you're running a 2-hour session and you can tell a complete story inside of an hour and 55 minutes, at least the people I've had the privilege to game with seem to appreciate that more than starting to push to like the 2-hour, 15-minute mark or even longer. And it's just because the people I play with, they've got lives. They have jobs to wake up to. They have kids to attend to or sports teams to watch. So rather than try to encroach on more time than we've agreed upon, I instead adjust my prep and style to fit in more story content in a smaller chunk of time. So it's just something to consider as you ask the question, how much time do I have? Now, like I mentioned, that was only one side of the coin. The other side is, how long is it taking you to prep? Now, I know a lot of game masters that love world building and story writing. In fact, some of them would be running these weekly 2-hour games, but some of them would be prepping for 4 to 6 hours. Now, when you're considering your real world prep time, one warning I frequently give that I first heard from Jim Davis from WebDM is if you're prepping so much that you start to resent your players for either not appreciating or engaging with the thing you've spent a lot of real world time fleshing out, that's going to cause some problems in the real world dynamics at the table. The general rule I give myself is I don't prep a game for longer than half the time I actually expect to be playing it. To go back to the 6-hour game, which I find is my sweet spot, that means I'm not really going to be prepping for longer than 3 hours. Usually in terms of coming up with a story or encounter design, that really doesn't take more than 30 minutes. The rest of my prep has to do with preparing battle maps or finding artwork online, the visual aids and music that are going to reinforce the core story that I want to run for my players. For me, the highest priority when it comes to prep is considering how long the session length is expected to be and how long it's going to take me to prep the experience. After that is where we get into the traditional subject matter when it comes to prep, developing NPCs, antagonists, the setting, and the plot. I wish I could tell you I had a consistent starting place when it comes to fleshing out a quest for my players, but I don't. If I'm requested to run some thrown together one-shot, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll just crack open the monster manual, I'll find an interesting opponent for the creatures to fight, and then kind of build the quest out from there. If it's part of an ongoing campaign, oftentimes I'll do things like look at player backstories or what they're currently investigating, try to add a little twist here or there to their expectations, while not completely undercutting or subverting them, and then develop creatures that are interesting to fight based on what those interests are. Overall, though, I think I can sum it up by saying, I think about what my players are going to remember from this game. For the most part, when I see most ongoing campaigns fizzle, and it isn't a scheduling thing, it's usually because the game master isn't moving the story along quick enough. The players don't feel a significant amount of progression or movement forward with the story, and their interest eventually just kind of wanes. Now, something that author and podcaster Malcolm Gladwell has said, which a lot of other people have said is true, he's just the name that stands out, is that stories and experiences are mostly judged for their endings. A lot of times, I'll even hesitate to go back to a story I love, because the conclusion of that story may be unsatisfying. An even simpler example is if you think about your day. A lot of times, you can be having a great day, and it can be ruined by something going wrong at the very end. Or you could be having a terrible day with a whole lot of things going wrong, but something awesome happens at the end of it, and you fall asleep feeling much, much better, even though it was one good thing in a sea of bad things. So when it comes to prepping content for your game, my recommendation is to just begin with the end in mind. What do you want your players to remember? Was it a challenging boss encounter? A big story or lore reveal? Something cathartic that happens with their characters? You can't really control what your players remember. I mean, recently I was a player in another GM's campaign alongside my mom as a player. The thing that stuck out to me was the balance of the encounter design and some of the creative world building choices the GM made. What stuck out to my mom was the beginning of the session when another player character bought everyone burritos. Now that sounds like a silly example, but this silly example demonstrated a growing amount of humanity in that player character who was a construct that was more analytical than human. And so, while you can plan for some memorable moments, you also want to be open and curious to what moments organically manifest at the table, because sometimes those can be the most meaningful of all. Now again, to get really specific about how I run my prep, again, I'm not really into resource management or deadly encounters. I'm actually okay with and encourage for my players to think in terms of maybe having 1 or 2 skirmishes in a session, but ending it with one big climactic battle. And oftentimes that one fight is the only fight in the session. What that does is, from an encounter design standpoint, I think of making every single skirmish count. I don't use random encounter tables because it makes the timing of my session less predictable. Again, personal preference. When I go about organizing the content of a story I want to run, I usually start with 3 acts. Act number 1 is the players warming up into the session. In a lot of my games, the player characters are part of a larger organization, some kind of adventurers guild, and the adventurers guild assigns them some kind of job. On the way to meet their quest giver, the player characters tend to catch up through dialogue. What have you been up to since the last time we adventured together? Did you invest in a business? Did you pursue a romantic relationship? Did you research a villain that's operating in the shadows? Once the player characters have kind of warmed up with their role-playing, that's when I introduce them to the quest giver that gives them the specific episodic story of this session. Then usually they go into an unknown environment, they explore a little, maybe fight some minions of the big bad of the session, and it ends with one big final showdown. A showdown which usually advances the story a little bit more. Because each session is episodic, usually my players can be like, oh yeah, that session with the vampire, or oh yeah, that session with the dragon at the end. Each session is distinct from each other, and none of them blend together. I'm even overt about this meta structure with my players, so that they know what to expect when coming into my game. And to be honest, I've met a few players that just aren't into that style, and that's okay. By being clear and upfront with what I love to run, it helps the players determine for themselves if this is a structure that they'd find exciting. A couple of months ago, I released a video called Table Agreements, which started with this quote from John Lund. Remember, all frustration is based on unmet expectations. I've read my fair share of horror stories on RPG forums or Reddit that basically boil down to players not buying into some sort of specific premise or theme the GM wants to explore. For example, let's say you're really excited to run Curse of Strahd, which is arguably the most popular and well-written adventure for 5th edition. That game has a really specific mood and draws on tropes of gothic horror. And if a GM is excited to run gothic horror, well, showing up with a character that's a plasmoid, or some min-maxed custom origin paladin that can just mow through undead, may not lean into kind of the atmosphere the GM wants to create. So I find step 3 of prep is once you understand the time frame you have for your session, and you have a story that you're excited to run, the next step is to actually prep your players. Let them know upfront what kind of story it's going to be, so that way they have a chance to buy in, and together both of you can get the most out of the game. A great example of this is actually a campaign I was running a few years ago. Every session, I would start with, here's the quest hook. And almost unanimously, my players would just go, nah, we don't want to do that, we want to go do something else. But they wouldn't give me a lot of specifics of the something else they'd want to do, and they wouldn't give me any time to prep that alternative adventure. So I reflect on myself pretty critically about that game because I was constantly flying by the seat of my pants, trying to keep up with whatever wacky ideas the players would have without being able to give them a satisfactory experience because I would be unprepared. Because of that, one thing I do now whenever I run a session is I request from my players, please bring a character that would accept the quest. Even if it's an unconventional quest, let's work together to discover a motivation that would result in your character going on the adventure. A great example of this is a game I ran where my mom was one of the players. I underestimated how moral her character was. So when I revealed that the quest giver was a crime boss that wanted the player characters to represent them in an underground fighting tournament, she said my character wouldn't accept that quest. But rather than just stopping the game there or abandoning the storyline I prepped, instead, together we came up with a reason why her character would accept it this one time. And that reason happened to be that another one of the player characters had a mom who had fallen ill, and the crime boss had access to the medicine to be able to cure her. So as my mom's character put it, I'm not fighting for you, I'm fighting for my friend's mom. Now, as a tangent to this, again, to loop back to the 7 baby steps of masterful game mastering, one of the reasons that I recommend that 7-step process for both new GMs or experienced GMs that are playing with a new player or new group of players is so that you can get a sense of player expectations. Whenever I play with a new player, I try to run a one-shot to gauge what their style is of play, what their preferences are, and whether or not we'll be a compatible match for a more committed game. To go back to Curse of Strahd, I may sit down with a player and run a one-shot. Just because I like heavy character development, they may like a more granular resource management approach. Now later, if I run Curse of Strahd, I may ask them, this is how I'm running this game in order to get the most specific outcome. Rather than just trusting them to jump into that campaign, I might run a one-shot with that specific tone and test to see if it's a good match. If it's not a good match for a big, long, ongoing campaign, well, at least we haven't committed enough time with each other that it's a big loss. If anything, we can have that closed experience and just kind of set it aside. There have been many times, though, where players have surprised me. For the first few games, we may have styles that might not match up, but when I'm the GM and I say, this is an expectation I have, and then I run a one-shot, oftentimes, because I'm clear in what my expectations are, they come up with awesome characters that fit into the atmosphere I want to create, and we have a great time. I will also say there have been some players where we just end up being incompatible for any session structure that's more than a one-shot. No matter if you agree with my particular preferences when it comes to TTRPGs, or whether they make you cringe, I think one nugget of wisdom everyone can take away from this process is to be clear about the game you're excited to run, to prep your players' expectations so that way they can buy in and your game can run better as a result. Again, I would filter them through the 7 baby steps because that way you can avoid a painful realization that your styles are incompatible, but only after you've already committed to a longer amount of gameplay time. To conclude, my specific methodology for prep is to prioritize the real-world timing that the game is going to take place in, set up a story in a simple 3-act structure for my players to move through, and to set my players' expectations, which also includes please accept the quests that I prep for you, and let them know about any specific tones that the game is going to require to get the most out of it. I spent a lot of my early GMing trying to run a game that I thought I was supposed to be running, instead of paying attention to what my players were positively responding to. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try new things. In fact, I recommend the opposite. For example, in my early days as a player, I probably would have said combat was my favorite pillar of play, but after a few years of it, I found that the social interaction was much more rewarding. So now I want to hear what all of you have to say. Do you enjoy prep, or is it a part of GMing that you dread? Are you someone that takes a lot of time to prep, or do you try to do as little as possible? Are there specific aspects of prep that I didn't touch on that you'd like me to flesh out more? Let me know in the comments down below. Hit like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. And have an awesome day, everybody. Remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.